So people were really suffering. People were saying like my mental health, like I'm broken. I lost my father. I wasn't able to even speak to him when he was dying. I can't speak to my family. I'm just sitting here. My mental health's broken. There's no support. They just tell me to phone the Samaritans. And there was a lot of that. There was just no support because nobody was able to come into the prison. So they weren't able to see anybody.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, the podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast. Marguerite Schinkel is a criminologist at the University of Glasgow and the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Her research has focused on the meaning of sentences for those who serve them, focusing on long-term and persistent short-term prison sentences. More recently, she's explored the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on penal experiences in Scotland, and she's hoping to explore local ways out of harm in her next project. She's the co-founder of the Coalition Against Punishment, which aims to disrupt the punishment system in Scotland. Good morning and welcome.
Good afternoon.
Welcome, Marguerite. Really nice to have you on here. So, Marguerite, if we start with some of your publications have been focused on unpicking the idea of people in prison becoming transformed by their experience of imprisonment. I think we're all familiar with those kind of tales of this miraculous transformation. Can you tell us how you came to be interested in this area?
Well, I actually came from philosophy, so I did an undergraduate in philosophy, and one of my teachers taught a module called Crime and Punishment, and that was Anthony Duff, who has this communicative theory of punishment. And I found myself wondering during that course, like, does anybody ever perceive it as communication? Like when they get a prison sentence or when they get any kind of sentence, do people think this is an attempt to communicate with me, or this is a way for the community to express their disapproval, or do they see it differently? And then when I came to do my master's, I realized there wasn't really that much research, or any research really, on how people perceive their sentences. So I decided to look at long-term sentences and probation, because I thought those were the two extremes in some ways in terms of communication, what might be communicated. And I thought that long-term sentences would be seen as the hardest. And that's what I started with, and as the most kind of exclusionary and those kind of things. But then in my very first interview for that project, the man I was talking to said, like, this sentence is the best thing that could have happened to me. And that really kind of surprised me, and that's how I then ended up not moving away from what I set out to do, because I still was really interested in, like, what does it mean to people and how is it communicated, but really ended up also looking at that idea of transformation in prison and where that came from in the interviews where that showed up.
Which is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think the idea that you were surprised to hear that, as I think I also would be, and yet if you think about the investment in imprisonment as a solution for crime, it seems like that must be quite a popular idea amongst the general public. But it seemed from reading your articles that you were picking up that this might be a somewhat contentious area for investigation. Is that something that you think?
Yeah, so I think that has been reported before, but it hadn't been interrogated very much, that idea that you're transformed in prison. And other people have kind of criticized that idea when criminologists kind of come out and say that people say this because prison is actually mostly bad for people, and I would also say that the general public, especially with long-term prison sentences, are probably more in support of punishment. But if you dig deeper, they might want things to change as well, but that doesn't seem to be the main focus of it. But from a criminological point of view, it's seen as a dangerous finding, because you don't want to be supporting the cause of prisons, or saying that prisons are a good place for people. There's very well-known research that shows that a lot of women are sent to prison for help, and you don't want to be supporting those kind of things, because even though like it would be good if good things happen in prison, it should still be imposed for punishment and not rehabilitation, because rehabilitation works better in the community.
Yeah, it seems so. What were your findings of your research?
So in relation to that transformation idea, it was very much that there was one particular group of long-term prisoners who told a story of transformation. So, and that wasn't so much related to what they had encountered in prison, but what they needed from their life story. So they, like, I see interviews as a place where people make meaning as well, and obviously they are telling it at a certain point in time. So the people I was speaking to were at the end of a long sentence, and they were, looking at coming out, and I found that there was, maybe, I don't want to call it a classification, or it's not like exclusive, like people can have different strategies or different ideas or different narratives about their imprisonment at the same time. But I found that people for whom imprisonment was kind of like an unexpected event or a blip in an otherwise quite positive life, so people who had like loving families and they'd been working in the past, but then they might have been convicted of drug couriering that they were doing to pay off a debt. Like they might get a long sentence, but they didn't expect to return to prison. They expected to return to their normal life, and often had resources to do that. So they might have family members who could offer them a job, or they might have financial resources, and they just had a life that made it likely that they would not reoffend again. Right, so that was one group. So they didn't tell anything. They didn't say anything about transformation in prison, because like life was going to continue the way it had before.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the other extreme, there was a group who had spent most of their childhood in children's homes often, and had many other prison sentences before, and who seemed kind of resigned to the idea that they would spend more time in prison in the future. Like they might say, yes, I'll try, but then at the same time they'd say like, oh, but I've said that before, and I'll probably end up here again, and they're going to put me in a hostel, and that's not going to work. So, they didn't see a future, or at least an immediate future, of not being imprisoned again for themselves. But there was also a group maybe who had quite a difficult background often, but who wasn't resigned, who weren't like people who weren't resigned to a future of imprisonment. So, but they came from having previous imprisonments, periods of imprisonment, and had committed other offences, and were kind of embroiled or kind of caught up in that life, and like the kind of also the revolving door of imprisonment and reoffending. But they did want a better future for themselves. But then if you are at the end of a prison sentence, there's nothing really that stands between your past that you want to get away from and your future, except for the prison sentence. So I kind of felt that was the only strategy they had, like the only narrative kind of resource they had, and then they would find things within the sentence to fit that. So I felt it wasn't so much about what they were offered in prison as what they needed from prison to make that story sound likely. So one guy, for example, said it made me more self-confident, but at the same time it had taken him down a notch, because he felt like he was carrying knives because he was really didn't have much self-confidence and felt like he needed a knife to be able to be a big guy in his neighborhood. But at the same time he felt that prison had kind of taught him about obeying people, and kind of so that he couldn't strut around and think he was better than everybody. So even though those are two contradictory things, he still found both remedies in prison. And there was lots of examples of that. And that's not to say that it was never about intentional interventions that the prison delivered. So for one person, he did talk about cognitive behavioral courses in very positive terms, and also said that it had really surprised him, like one of the interventions by the people who delivered that program had really surprised him, that like his kind of gut reaction or immediate reaction to a girlfriend sitting in a pub with a guy he doesn't know would be violence. They said, what about if that's her brother? And he was like, oh, really taken aback, and saw that he needed to take a step back. But most people I spoke to were quite critical of those programs, in that they were requirements, so people who were there weren't really motivated to take them, and that they wouldn't really change anything for them long term. One thing I should say is that the prison where I did my PhD research, which is what I'm talking about now, was a very safe prison, and people saw that prison generally in quite positive terms. So I think that also is needed to make it possible to think about it as a positive influence on your life and as transformational. So relationships with staff were positive, People said the time went fast, like it was a fast jail, because there was a lot of activities on offer, and there wasn't a lot of violence. So compared to, say, Whitemoor, that where people have reported a really oppressive regime where people seem to cope by getting their head outside the jail, in this prison people said, like, I'm keeping my head inside the jail and forgetting about life outside. And so in that sense it was an easier environment for them to navigate, but also for them to give a positive kind of position in their lives.
It sounded a bit like you were saying that people use a kind of adopting a certain mental mindset to try and make sense of the fact they're having this sentence and needing to make use. You know, when people adopt a different perspective, it can help them feel differently about things. Say, for instance, adopting a gratitude mindset, for argument. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but that sense of if they adopt the mindset that prison is going to be their transformational process, that could somehow help them in some way.
Well, I think that definitely helped them while they were in a prison, as did that idea of like having their head inside a jail, and people were talking about that. And in my writing I also discuss how that influences how people see their sentence, because you can't basically oppose your sentence and at the same time be like, oh, but this is the best thing that happened to me, or even just like be happy that, like, accept where you are and make the best of it while you're in that prison, because you have to carry that anger all the time. So that even extended to people who said they were innocent but then found a way to still make it okay that they were in prison. So either saying, I would have done something like this if I hadn't got prison this time, or I have done other things that I haven't got caught for, so it's fair enough that I'm in prison this time. They might still be opposing it and appealing it, but they're still finding a way to accept it. And I think that works while you are in prison. Like, I think that's a good adaptation to being in this kind of prison, but the question is, how good is that for when you come out?
Thank you. And you mentioned people perhaps referring to people that they met in prison, and certainly that's been a theme that's come up in a couple of interviews that we've done before, where people have spoken about people who've previously been imprisoned actually have spoken about encountering somebody in prison that believed in them, and that made them feel worthwhile and made a difference to their lives. But I wondered, were there other aspects of prison that were associated with transformation, and whether these were intentional or whether these were just incidental to imprisonment?
Yeah, I guess so. My argument about this particular prison, right, I'm not talking about a therapeutic community or a prison where anything in particularly was like particularly innovative or anything was being delivered, like just the cognitive behavioural courses that the Scottish government has kind of accepted as using. So I have to say that when I really dug down with people about why this, and it wasn't everybody, right, who thought their prison sentence was transformation. It was like maybe 4 out of 12 or so. But if I dug down about why that was, I felt I couldn't really give lots of satisfactory answers, except for the one guy who talked about the cognitive behavioural course and one moment in that cognitive behavioural course, which you then still have to question, is that going to have the power to help outside? Because in a previous role I evaluated one of those cognitive behavioural courses, and they started out with like, why do you offend? And there was often a lot of emotions involved with that, like lack of confidence or feeling bad about themselves and needing to feel better. But then in the relapse prevention plans at the end of the course, that were kind of the culmination of that course, it was much more like, oh, I'm just going to sit in my hostel and close my door and not let anybody in so that I don't get pulled into trouble. But you're kind of going like, well, you're not addressing those emotions. So I think, I'm not saying there's no place for cognitive behavioural courses, but and that is also what I found, is that I also talked to people who had been released from prison, and that they found it much harder to tell a positive story about their experiences than people who were still in prison but coming up to release. I do think that that's for some people that's an optimistic moment, right? Like when just before you're released, you can think, well, I've learned a lot in this sentence. One thing that people did say actually is learning from older prisoners often. So older prisoners who'd spent a lot of time in prison and who had kind of taught them to avoid conflict, who said, you don't want to end up like me. You don't want to end up doing a life sentence when you're in your 40s. Pull yourself together, and this is how you do it. So there was some mention of that.
So as you've just alluded to, you also contrasted the scripts of men who are currently in prison to those who've been released. What were some of the challenges that your participants spoke of in terms of managing to desist once they'd been released from prison?
Well, I should first of all say that they were all managing to desist because I was speaking to them in the community, right? So they had all served long-term sentences, and if they weren't desisting, they'd be back in prison because they were on license in the community. So the other thing is that I recruited people through criminal justice social workers who kind of supervise licenses in Scotland. So I was always going to get the people who were doing better to some extent through that recruitment strategy, right? So they were desisting, but they weren't finding meaning or progress in that desistance. So a lot of them were very frustrated with the lack of opportunities, with being knocked back at any employment kind of, like when they had any kind of interviews, if they even got to interview, they just get knocked back because of their previous convictions. They just weren't really given any chances. Like their conviction and their criminal record. I mean, obviously, if you've served a long-term sentence, then the offences on your criminal record include serious ones. Or it might be the only one, but that will be a serious one in the eyes of employers. And so the only person who had managed to get any kind of work had set up his own business, and he was going on holiday. So he seemed like a success story, but he still said that he really missed prison. And he found it really difficult to engage with people and for people to need him and to need other people after having lived this life of keeping your head inside the prison and not thinking about the outside world and being disconnected from people.
And did any of the people that you spoke about in the community, did any of them speak about having held this notion of transformation whilst they were inside, but then having, did that shift? I just wonder what proportion of the men might have had this idea of transformation while they're in prison and then lose it when they get out of prison, but you might not know the answer to that.
No, well, I mean, at least one of them spoke very clearly about that, that's the one I was talking about, who was both underconfident and overconfident in his own eyes, and for whom prison had addressed both those things pretty much unintentionally. He like, and it's a quote I've used before and will probably use a lot more, but like, he felt that he had a transformational prison sentence. He was coming out, he was going to college. He had the start of the story, of a positive story of, yes, it's changed my life on the outside, but I don't think that he finished college, he wasn't getting any jobs. His license, which he did find helpful with, the support from his criminal justice social worker was ending, but he hadn't achieved any of the things he wanted to achieve. And he said, so it's all a waste, my sentence, all the energy I've put into it, it's a waste. So he felt that transformational potential of his sentence hadn't become reality, partly because of how hard it was outside.
That's a shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I was reading your paper, The Pains of Desistance, and I was because I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a very enjoyable paper, and it left me with rather a heavy heart, actually. And I'm a psychotherapist by background, so I've always struggled with the whole notion of desistance, and I don't think I've ever entered into work with anybody or with a group of people hoping that I will enable them to desist from something. That was never the object. The object was always much more about how do we foster development and growth, with the idea that this, because of course one never really wanted them to reoffend or to hurt or harm anybody, so that was always in mind, but it was never kind of an objective. And I think that's why psychotherapists struggle a bit in the criminal justice system, because other professions seem to be able to take on the mantle of stopping people doing things. And of course the CBT programs that you mentioned are specifically designed to at least at least show some intent to do that. Whether they do it or not is, of course, very contentious. Sorry, it's a bit of a ramble. I was also struck by something that you said about somebody who felt they'd been changed by something that happened in a CBT setting, and it reminded me really of when I was at school. I wasn't very good at school, but I did have an English teacher whose name was Mr. Beale, who taught us about Beowulf with great enthusiasm, and that had a tremendous influence on me. So I think it's something about these kind of microcosms of events, small events, which somehow get into us that can make a difference. So anyway,
can I just say about desistance though, because I think that's also the point that I'm coming to, and a colleague and me are writing about that at the moment, is that I think we should all move away from desistance, because because my more recent research is about people who go in and out of prison, but in their experience, like, it's not desistance that's important, it's like moving away from really difficult circumstances in general, so from being harmed and harming others through drug use, through victimization of actual offences, through lots of different things, some of which are criminal and some of which aren't criminal. But it's about a whole life, really. I don't think we can any longer even just use that as an organising concept, like, are people offending or are they not offending? It should be about much more. But sometimes I worry that it's not, I'm not saying that individuals wouldn't benefit from psychotherapy or other interventions, but I kind of feel like as a society we need to have on some of those interventions in terms of how we think about things, and when is somebody, even if we accept that people need to go to prison for punishment, then why is the punishment not over when they leave prison? Like, how do we justify the idea that with a criminal record you can't have lots of different jobs? And how do you justify, you know, like the kind of, even the punitivity of welfare benefits? Like, if you're coming from prison, you can't find a job for love or money. You know, you still get punished within those welfare systems as well. And really, it should be over. Like, you should have paid your debt to society. That's how punishment should work. I prefer to not have a punishment-based justice system. But even within that system, I think we're doing things the wrong way.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Before COVID, a lot of my time was spent visiting and reviewing approved premises around England and Wales, and often when I was doing that, I felt I became very attuned to the kind of hopelessness that you describe in your papers, because when you go to an AP, what you do is you lose that kind of sense of certainty and clarity that you had whilst you were in prison, and suddenly you're faced with, well, the very opposite, uncertainty, the idea that you may have a very short period of time living somewhere and then be expected to live somewhere else and you don't know where, and if you don't find anywhere, then the chance are you'll go back to prison. So it was a kind of setting filled with anxiety and encroaching hopelessness.
And life outside would be hard for anybody in those circumstances, but when you've also spent a long time in prison, whether that's in one sentence or in lots of short sentences, you've also been completely de-skilled at dealing with any of that chaos. Like, you've become used to a very kind of regimented existence in which you don't need to organise anything, like everything's organised for you. So people often who talk to me about, like, I can't cope with bills, I don't understand public transport, and now even more so. So my most recent research was about how COVID impacted on penal experiences. But, you know, coming out into a world where everybody's in their houses, where everybody's locked up, but suddenly you can't go to the office of the council office or the whatever office that you need to do, how you used to do it to make an appointment, but you have to phone people up or you have to use the internet. That's very, very difficult.
So, well, we've touched upon the kind of settled and consistent nature of being in prison. But do you think that the amount of time that you spend in prison, or indeed the number of previous sentences that you've had, do you think it makes a difference to your ability or capacity to desist?
So, like, I'm not saying that this is true everywhere, right? But from my research, because prisons are different and obviously people are different and the constellations are different in different countries. But in my research, I found that long-term sentences, like so in Scotland that is over 4 years, it seems that people feel like they need to make something out of that. So yes, you get institutionalized and you have all these problems, especially if you decide that the best way to survive that is to cut off contact with people and not to think about the outside world. But at least there's that impetus to kind of make it mean something, because otherwise you've just lost years of your life. Whereas in my more recent research, where people have spent 20 years in prison, but in all very short sentences for very minor offences, it's very different, I think. I think that makes prison completely meaningless, but also de-skills you at the same time, and even becomes a resource for some people to go to prison on purpose, so that at least they have a roof over their heads and food 3 times a day, rather than being homeless on the streets of Glasgow, for example.
Thank you. So how can we make it easier for people to desist, do you think?
Well, I think the criminal justice system in general makes that harder, and that's not only prisons but also police. So if you have a police officer in your neighbourhood who knows you as a persistent offender, then you've got very little chance to get away. You know, like, we would have a hard time even in those circumstances not to get picked up, because they might approach you and they could accuse you of police assault even if you haven't assaulted them, and you'll never be believed over them in a court of law. So we've had people say, like, they just want to get a conviction out of somebody and I'm an easy target. That's an extreme, but I think, like, just life in general for people with criminal convictions or who have been criminalized is a level harder even than the other people who have similarly difficult circumstances but haven't been criminalized. So I think first of all we need to rethink that. Like in Scotland there's a bit more attention to a public health approach, at least to these low level crimes. Or we might want to think about, like, should we imprison people for longer and longer who are committing really, really minor crimes. So if it's breach of the peace 20 times, maybe you should just get the same sentence for your 20th breach of the peace as for your first. Or we could decide if prison isn't working for people, then we need to do something else, say after the second prison sentence. Like, why does prison become the default that we just keep returning to when nothing else? Cyrus often say in Scotland, like, well, community sentences haven't worked for you, so now I'm just sending you to prison. But that people change, like, people's motivation to move away from these difficult life circumstances and the actions that they commit within that, they change as well. So I think people need to keep, like, I think there's a lot wrong at the front end of sentencing, but I think if we wanted to make desistance easier, or actually allow people to have more meaningful lives when they're desisting, I think there just needs to be far more opportunities for people and far less stigma attached to having a criminal conviction.
Yeah, that's a very hopeful aspiration, isn't it? That's the kind of nub of the problem. So, what research are you currently working on then?
So, at the moment I'm writing from the COVID project that I was talking about. So we're talking about the impact on mental health and the kind of how conditions within prison changed during lockdown and became a very different kind of imprisonment, sometimes tantamount to torture, like, more than 15 days without any meaningful human contact for over 22 hours a day, I think is defined as torture by the United Nations and in the Mandela rules. So we're writing about that, which is obviously maybe even more depressing. But what I'm working at the moment is a funding application to look at local ways out of harm. So really looking at very local places and seeing what kind of opportunities there are within those local places that support and both detract from people trying to develop better lives. So really what you're saying about how do we allow people to do better or to find this easier, I think might need to be a very local issue and needs to be investigated locally, but also, so what we're wanting to do is look at an urban location and a rural location, because I think we really don't know very much about how these configurations happen in the countryside. We know Glasgow, for example, is fairly well researched in these kind of terms, But what happens when you're living in a really small community? So people know you, and that can be a good thing because they know you your whole life. So your your criminal convictions aren't the most important thing about you. But at the same time, everybody knows you. So if you've got a conviction, you can't be anonymous in any kind of setting. So that's what we're hoping to look at.
You remind me, in what you were just saying, of when the COVID lockdowns began, and as you say, prisoners were locked up in their cells for 22, 23 hours a day. And it was very difficult to get any movement on that from the prison service, because there was a kind of mantra which came back, which went along the lines of our prime focus is the protection of life. And of course you couldn't get beyond that, because who could argue against the protection of life? So things got...
It's interesting that we did a prison survey. That was the only way that we could speak to prisoners direct, that we could get views from people who are now in prison rather than have been released from prison recently. And there we only got comments, and we had an open text comment, and a lot of people mentioned there the long times that they were locked up and the total lack of coping mechanisms that they had developed, like the gym or education or doing, seeing their family. That was all cut off. But interestingly, we got feedback from the Scottish Prison Service when we presented those results that, for example, shots had been locked up a lot less than other prisons. So shots in Scotland holds a lot of long-term prisoners. But then we were like, well, if that's possible, I mean, obviously shots has fewer receptions and fewer people leaving, but their staff is still coming in and out. So if you can do that in one prison, then why can't you learn from that and do something similar in other prisons rather than returning to these long lockups every time that COVID cases rise in the community?
And you reminded me there was another embargo, at least in England and Wales. So there was an embargo on learning from the experience. So research was not allowed. So you had the somewhat weird situation where psychologists and other clinical staff were told to stay at home, and at the same time told you can't do any research.
Yeah, and we found also that there was absolutely no mental health support for people. So people were really suffering. People were saying, like, my mental health, like, I'm broken. I lost my father. I wasn't able to even speak to him when he was dying. I can't speak to my family. I'm just sitting here. My mental health's broken. There's no support. They just tell me to phone the Samaritans. And there was a lot of that. There was just no support because nobody was able to come into the prison. So they weren't able to see anybody.
Well, it does seem to have been an inconsistency, doesn't there, from prison to prison, but also even within prison, I would say. And I suppose what the prison service is very good at doing is hiding behind, as David said, the mantra of, well, we're saving lives. But I suppose even prior to this, we hear this at times about security trumps everything. And it can then make it hard to unpick and see what is possible, even when there needs to be restrictions of some sort.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, some adaptations were made. Like, I know that the chaplains did their services online, for example, and that meant that more people could access them. But I think on the whole, there wasn't a lot of very creative thinking or just concern for people's humanity. Can you lock somebody up in a small cell for 22 hours a day with horrendous circumstances for everybody? Like, everybody was worried about their families are worried about them, during COVID, and then just leave them to it and just leave them to manage that kind of increased tension that happens anyway in the prison when all this kicks off. And people mentioned, like, mentally ill prisoners, like, banging on their doors all night, so then nobody's sleeping, and just general tensions and more snippiness and difficulty, and staff relationships being worse because the staff didn't want to be there either and had been pulled from their usual roles to, like, just do the lockups and whatever. So it sounded like a very tense environment, but with no safety valves, and people just had to manage that themselves, and there was no options. Like, there was no considerations of maybe this is more important. I mean, fair enough, like, I don't know if there was any deaths of COVID in England. There wasn't, I think, in Scotland, in prisons, and that's obviously positive compared to America or other places, but at what cost? And there was definitely a fair few suicides during that time.
So you've recently become associated with the slogan, "Demand less remand." Can you tell us something about this campaign?
Yeah, so that came really out of the Coalition Against Punishment, which wasn't called that then yet, but it was like a series of meetings that we'd set up to kind of have a more radical conversation about criminal justice in Scotland. Because one thing that Scotland's often positioned as being more enlightened than England and Wales, and that's maybe true in terms of the political rhetoric. Like, there's a lot of positive kind of things being said about it, but at the same time, in reality, we lock up just as many people. We've got more life sentence prisoners than anybody else in Western Europe. It's not great. Like, we're not doing actually well on the ground. And so we were trying to move away from kind of having those conversations with people who say yes, but then nothing happens, and doing something a little bit different, and not looking at reform in the margins that then just maybe legitimizes imprisonment further, but looking at more radical things. And so one of the meetings was about remand, because there's huge problems with remand in Scotland. There's so many people in remand, and then that combined with the court backlogs due to COVID means that people are on remand for very long times without any certainty of when their cases being heard. It's also the case that over half of people in Scotland on remand are released from remand, so they don't go on to serve a prison sentence. And that can be because they've already served so long, but it's obviously often also because their offence didn't merit imprisonment, right? And then they have spent all that time in prison without any kind of restitution or anything. You don't get that time back, you don't get any payment for that time. You might have lost your house, you might have lost relationships, you might have lost your job. Yeah, so that is a definite problem. And in that meeting we were thinking about, okay, what can we do about this rather than have the normal conversations? And we decided that we could use social media to our advantage. And so we set up a camp. So with a small group of people we set it up, but we asked everybody to come to kind of contribute to a Google Doc where people could put in information, and people had presented information at the meeting. So we just highlighted the stuff that we had heard in terms of numbers, but also the impact on families and other issues. You know, the people who die on remand. I mean, that's an issue, and mental health, and all kinds of difficult things that are happening. So we kind of organized that day by day. So we had 5 days of action, and we had a graphic designer make images for it, and we just put that on Twitter. And we did get some results.
Can you say anything more about any of those things? You referred to people dying on remand, for instance, and I was also curious about how long people were spending on remand.
So one thing we found was that, and that's research is difficult because one of us knew about research that hasn't been published yet, but that suggested that people are on remand for quite long times on average, much longer than was said. I'd have to look up the actual figures if you want me to. But also, so Alan Marshall is somebody in Scotland who died while he was on remand because prison officers tackled him. And he died as a result because there was too many of them for too long on top of his body. Let me see if I can find these. So 4 young people under the age of 21 died to suicide while on remand. So that's also deaths on remand. And there's just so many here. We did have quite a lot. So 27% of the Scottish prison population was on remand on April the 30th. So April passed. So that's quite a large proportion of the prison population. And 57% of people on remand don't go on to be given a prison sentence. So that is really kind of crazy. And then if you look at young people, it's even worse because, I mean, there's not a lot of young people in Scottish prisons, but there shouldn't be any. So of 16 and 17-year-olds, there was 18 in prison, but 15 out of those were on remand. So that's almost all of them, 83%. There's some really difficult, and then obviously for women, they're often then kept far away from their families, and because they're further away from home. I can't find how to. There you are.
Shocking figures.
So they are shocking figures, and I know that in England and Wales it's not great either. But again, Scotland pretends to be this really forward-thinking nation, and we keep wanting to take the prison numbers down, but we're not tackling what's happening with remand. which is actually, so they're trying to get the prison, how they're trying to impose, they have imposed the presumption against short prison sentences in Scotland of under 12 months, but they acknowledged themselves in the consultation about that it wouldn't have much impact on the prison figures, partly because such high numbers are either on remand or on long sentences.
Thank you. As you say, these are shocking figures, and I think one of the things we discover really as we have these conversations is that while we're faced on a daily basis with the extremely loud rhetoric of punishment, actually if people knew more about these profound injustices, such as the number of people who are locked up without being convicted, and of course we also have contact with people who are working with those on indeterminate public protection sentences which go on and on, without end, profound injustices. And I think campaigns like yours are terribly important to keep these things in the public eyesight.
In a sense, we kind of see it almost as an opportunity in that everybody who comes into contact with the criminal justice system sees the injustice, right? There's not a lot of people who have a family member go to prison, for example, or who work in the criminal justice system in some capacity, maybe with the exception of some prison staff, who don't see how difficult it is for people and what damage the criminal justice system does. So hopefully, if we can inform more people of that, then if we can influence public debate in that way and get more people to see that, then that's, I think, the only hope we have of changing it, because at the moment, the political and public debate around, like you say, it's all about punishment and not really thinking beyond that.
Thank you. So finally, Marguerite, quite a few of your participants seem to have spoken about painful experiences such as loneliness and hopelessness, and I mentioned earlier how I picked up a sense of hopelessness from reading your paper. How have you managed to keep yourself optimistic and emotionally nourished whilst doing this work?
I don't know if I always have. I have a PhD student starting just now who's looking at mental health in prison, and she asked that very question. How do I get through this without my own mental health deteriorating? And I think it is difficult, and I think you need to talk to other people, like people who are doing similar work to you, and kind of believe that what you are doing does have some purpose and might have some impact, even though it's very, I'm also very aware that people have been doing this kind of work for 20, 30 years, if not longer, and it hasn't had that kind of impact, but better things. I think one thing that helps is that criminal justice is like a human construct, like we make it happen. It's not something, not that I don't think we should do something about climate change, but climate change is kind of inexorable, whereas as a society we could decide we're going to completely do something different. And one quote I like is that somebody in America said, it's not so hard to imagine a world without prisons and police, just go to any middle class neighborhood. Like, how much are they policed, how much are they imprisoned, right? So that does give me hope, but at the same time doing things like the Coalition Against Punishment and having at least some sense that you're trying to change things, I think helps. But I'm also consciously moving away from asking people about their life stories in my next research project. Like, I'm going to be asking, okay, which places are significant to you, and some of that stuff will come out. But I think also maybe we don't need more descriptions or quotes from people showing how distressed and how difficult their lives are. I think we know that by now, that many of the people in prison are in those situations.
Yeah, I guess you're kind of highlighting how reason doesn't seem to be winning out, does it, in terms of our approach to justice. So we know that restorative justice, for instance, it tends to be more highly appreciated, even by people who've been on the receiving end of crime, and yet we still carry on doing same old that we've been doing for a very long time.
And I'm very interested in Greenland, where one of my colleagues from Denmark, she's at the moment training lawyers there because they don't have any lawyers, because in Greenland they had the more traditional form of kind of justice, more place-based, but they're now moving to the criminal justice system we all have, and you kind of go like, oh, maybe we should go over there and figure out what they were doing. Because they had no prisons, so that is an interesting juxtaposition, really.
Well, they had a prison in Denmark, I think, didn't they?
They do. I have been to a prison in Denmark, and it was interesting that the long-term prison was amazing. I had 2 very small children at the time, and an older child, and part of me thought, like, this would be okay to stay here for a week. Like, it was kind of like beautiful buildings, beautiful views, lots of computer access. There was like a whole flat for family to come and visit. So that was interesting, but then the short-term prison was totally shabby. The cells were tiny, with no toilets or anything in it. But that is because they can go out during the day, right? So again, a different way of approaching what prison might be.
Well, there's a more hopeful note to end on. So thank you very much indeed, Marguerite. That was a great conversation.
That's right. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another of those conversations that was slightly depressing at points during it. I was quite shocked by those figures in terms of how many people are on remand, and when you look at the percentage that don't then get a custodial sentence, that's shocking, really, isn't it, when you think about the effect that then has on people's lives.
Yeah, that was. I read the paper, The Pains of Desistance, and as I said earlier, it kind of made me feel a bit hopeless. I really kind of tuned in with the hopelessness, and it took me to many of the people I've met touring the country visiting these approved premises over the past 3 years or so. And so it really made me feel quite despondent, but talking with Marguerite about it, she's quite an uplifting sort of person, and she's obviously able to continue her work without becoming too weighed down by it. In fact, quite the opposite. So it worked out great in the end, I think. Many thanks again to all of you who have listened to our Locked Up Living podcast. Feel free to mention this to your friends and to your colleagues, and give us feedback on our webpage lockeduplives.com and our Twitter account Locked Up Living. Many thanks too to Pete and Rach, who kindly allowed us to use their music. You Have Called Me Courage, and this is available from all the usual outlets.